April 23, 1945, 3 hours and 45 minutes in the morning, deep in the German Black Forest, 50 miles south of Professor Dr. Werner Karl Heisenberg, 43 years old, Nobel Prize winner in physics, was sitting alone in his improvised office inside the underground complex that the Nazis had built under 20 meters of solid rock and reinforced concrete. His hands shook as he held a cup of cold ersatz coffee, not from the non-existent stimulant in the drink, but from the sheer weight of what he knew was happening 3 levels below his feet. Heisenberg's dark hair, already gray at the temples despite his relative youth, was disheveled from a sleepless night. His metal-rimmed glasses, smudged and foggy, rested crookedly on his thin nose as he stared at the equations scribbled on dozens of sheets spread across the rough wooden table. Beside him, a framed photograph showed his wife Elizabeth and their 7 children in happier times. Before the war, before all this, Heisenberg had been one of Europe's most brilliant physicists, a disciple of Niels Bohr, a contemporary of Einstein, the architect of quantum mechanics that had revolutionized human understanding of reality. Now, in this cold, damp chamber, hidden in the heart of dying Germany, he was the scientific director of the German nuclear program that was a mere 8 hours away from producing the world's first working atomic bomb. 3 floors below, in what the Nazis called Halle Null, Hall Zero, an enriched uranium reactor was rapidly approaching the critical mass needed to initiate a sustained chain reaction. Heisenberg's calculations, obsessively checked and rechecked over the past 72 hours without adequate sleep, indicated that by 11:30 minutes that morning the reactor would reach the exact point of efficiency needed to produce enough military-grade plutonium for a bomb that Heinrich Himmler, of the SS, had personally promised to use against London within 6 days. Heisenberg glanced at the clock on the wall, a simply Swiss-made model that relentlessly ticked away each second. 7 hours and 45 minutes. Enough time for what he needed to do. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he kept locked even from the other scientists on the project, and took out a worn leather notebook. Inside, in his meticulous handwriting, were the real equations, the real calculations that he had kept hidden from everyone for nearly 2 years. The equations that showed not how to build an atomic bomb, but how to ensure that an atomic bomb would never work. 2 years and 8 months earlier, in August 1942, at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institut Physik in Berlin, Heisenberg had received a visit that would change everything. It was a Sunday afternoon, August 23rd, specifically, and he was alone in the laboratory when he heard discreet knocks on the back door, the one that led to the narrow alley where delivery trucks arrived. When he opened it, he found Niels Bohr, his former Danish mentor, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and shabby coat, disguised as a common laborer. Bohr, then 57, had risked his life to cross Nazi-occupied Europe with an urgent message. They talked for just 17 minutes, every second fraught with mortal danger if they were discovered. Bohr spoke quickly, in fluent German but with his distinctive Danish accent, about the American Manhattan Project, about how Allied physicists were building their own atomic bomb, about how Jewish scientists expelled from Germany were now working to defeat Hitler with the very physics that Germany had despised as Jewish science. And then Bohr said something that burned into Heisenberg's consciousness from that moment on. Werner, you're the only one who can stop Hitler from getting that weapon first. You know physics better than any of them. You can make it look like you're trying, while making sure they never succeed. Heisenberg had shaken his head in automatic denial, fear gnawing at his stomach. They will kill my family. They will kill me. Bohr held his shoulders with surprising strength for a man his age. They'll kill millions if they get that bomb. London first, then Moscow, then New York. Werner, you made the uncertainty principle. Use it now. Create enough uncertainty that they'll never be sure why the bomb doesn't work. When Bohr left, disappearing into the alley like a ghost, Heisenberg stood in the darkness of the laboratory for 2 hours with her mind processing not just the physics of what she needed to do, but the terrifying mathematics of betrayal, sacrifice, and the fate of nations. He was German. He loved his country. But he was, first and foremost, a scientist who understood that some discoveries should not belong to monsters. As Heisenberg began his silent campaign of scientific sabotage in Berlin at the top-secret facility at Los Alamos, New Mexico, 50-year-old Brigadier General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, read intelligence reports with growing alarm. It was the 17th of September, 1942, 9 o'clock in the morning, and Groves was sitting at his temporary desk in a building that still smelled of fresh paint and freshly sawn wood. His burly 200-pound bulk was crammed into a standard military chair that creaked under his weight with every movement. Groves was an Army engineer, West Point graduate, World War I veteran, and the man who had overseen the construction of the Pentagon. Now, he commanded the largest secret scientific project in human history, employing more than 130,000 people in facilities spread throughout the United States. And the reports coming back from Europe through top-secret intelligence channels said one thing clear. The Germans were advancing their own nuclear program faster than anyone had predicted. 36-year-old Colonel Kenneth Nichols, Groves's direct assistant, stood at the table, his impeccable military posture contrasting with Groves's disheveled appearance after a night of meetings that lasted until 4 in the morning. "General," Nichols said, tapping his finger on a map of Germany spread out on the table. "Our agents have confirmed that the Germans are concentrating resources at an underground facility here in the Black Forest. Aerial photographs show massive construction activity, new railroad tracks, dozens of truckloads of concrete per week for the past 8 months. And there's more." Nichols placed a series of black and white photographs on the table. These are well-known German scientists entering the facility. Heisenberg has been seen 14 times in the last 2 months. Otto Hahn, Karl Friedrich von Weiss, Karl Wirth. All of Germany's top nuclear physicists are concentrated at this location. Groves picked up one of the photos in his large hands and examined the grainy image of Heisenberg entering a gate guarded by SS soldiers. "Heisenberg," he murmured, the name coming out like a curse. "The man who discovered the uncertainty principle will give us certainty that the Nazis will have the bomb first." He threw the photos on the table in frustration. "How many times did I tell Oppenheimer that we needed more speed? How many times?" Nichols swallowed hard before responding. "Sir, Dr. Oppenheimer estimates that we need at least another 18 months for a working prototype. Perhaps 24 months for a real bomb that we can drop from a plane. The Germans, according to our intelligence, could have something working in 6 to 9 months. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of construction outside. Groves stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the Gems Mountains that surrounded Los Alamos, their minds processing tactical, strategic, impossible possibilities. "If Hitler gets an operational atomic bomb," he sighed slowly, each word carrying terrible weight, "the war is over. He doesn't need many. One in London to force the British to surrender, one in Moscow to break the Soviets. The Americans are left alone on the other side of the Atlantic, facing an enemy with weapons that can vaporize entire cities. We cannot invade Europe. We cannot win." He turned to Nichols, his normally stern face now showing deep fatigue. "We have to delay them. Sabotage. Bombing. Assassination, if necessary. Anything to buy enough time for us to get there first." But what Groves did not know, what no Allied intelligence had uncovered, was that the most effective sabotage of the German nuclear program was already underway, conducted not by British commandos or American agents, but by the very scientists the Nazis trusted completely to deliver them final victory. During the following months, from October 1942 until March 1943, Heisenberg carried out what would later be recognized by historians of science as the most brilliant scientific disinformation campaign ever conducted. He couldn't simply stop the project that would be an obvious betrayal that would result in its immediate execution, act, and the death of his family. Instead, he used his authority as scientific director to introduce subtle but fundamental errors into the calculations, errors that seemed plausible but guaranteed that the reactor would never reach critical efficiency. On November 23, 1942, during a meeting with Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, and a group of SS officers who knew as much about nuclear physics as a medieval peasant would know about astronomy, Heisenberg presented his carefully falsified projections. He was wearing his best gray suit, the one Elizabeth had insisted he wear 4 meetings with high-ranking officials, even though it was wrinkled from nights sleeping in the lab. His glasses reflected the light from the lamps as he drew elaborate diagrams on a blackboard, his voice maintaining the professorial tone he had used in hundreds of university lectures before the war. Our Rise Minister, Heisenberg said, pointing to a series of equations that seemed impressive but were intentionally incorrect, in ways that only another elite nuclear physicist could detect. Our calculations indicate that we require approximately 2 tons of highly enriched uranium to reach critical mass. In a bomb design, this requires processing approximately 50 tons of uranium, a process that will take a minimum of 18 to 24 months with our current centrifuge capacity. Speer, 40, an architect by training whom Hitler had transformed into the industrial czar of the Reich, frowned as he took notes. Professor Heisenberg, couldn't the Americans be advancing faster with methods we are not considering? It was the question Heisenberg had been waiting for, the opening to plant more seeds of doubt and delay. It is possible, our Rates Minister, but highly unlikely. The fundamental physics is the same for everyone. The Allies face the same technical challenges as we do. In fact, given that they kicked out their best physicists for being Jews, it is likely that they are even further behind than we are. He gestured to another set of equations. Our biggest challenge is not uranium enrichment, but detonation design. An error of just a few microseconds in explosion timing, and the bomb becomes just a radioactive dispersal device. Dangerous, but not catastrophic. We need absolute precision. What Heisenberg didn't say, what he buried in technical jargon and complex mathematics, was that the numbers he was presenting were off by a factor of approximately 3. The actual amount of uranium needed was significantly less. The actual processing time would be much shorter, but the Nazi officials in the room had no way of knowing this. They saw only an internationally recognized genius presenting science that was beyond their understanding, and they chose to believe. Meanwhile, deep within the Black Forest facility being built specifically for the work continued day and night under brutal SS supervision. SS Klaus Reinhardt, 32 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, with a scar running from his left temple to his chin, commanded the installation's security with characteristic German efficiency and SS ruthlessness. Reinhardt knew nothing about nuclear physics, but he understood schedules, quotas, and the consequences of failing to deliver results to Reichsführer Himmler perfectly well. It was January 15th, 6 o'clock in the morning, when Reinhardt was making his daily inspection of the underground facilities. He marched down concrete corridors lit by bare electric bulbs that hung from the ceiling at regular 15-foot intervals, his boots clicking with military rhythm on the polished floor. Behind him, 2 SS guards carrying Sturmgewehr 44 followed 3 paces away, eyes constantly scanning for threats or irregularities. The temperature in the tunnels was a constant 12 degrees Celsius, cold enough that Reinhardt could see his own breath forming small clouds of vapor with each exhalation. The walls were covered in exposed pipes that carried cooling water, electrical cables as thick as human arms, and numbered valves that controlled systems whose purpose Reinhardt neither fully understood nor cared to understand. His job was security, not science. When he arrived at Halle No, the great hall where the nuclear reactor was being built, he found a scene of frenzied activity. 53 workers, a mix of skilled German technicians and Soviet prisoners of war considered sufficiently educated for technical work, moved like a form gas is organized around the central structure of the reactor. It was a cubic pile 3 meters on a side, made of blocks of ultra-pure graphite interspersed with cylinders of natural uranium. The design was based on Heisenberg's calculations that Reinhardt had no way of knowing were intentionally flawed. Reinhardt saw Dr. Karl Wirtz, 41 years old, an experimental physicist who served as chief engineer for the reactor construction, supervising the placement of a new set of cadmium control rods. Wirtz was a small, nervous man, perpetually worried, who wore a white lab coat stained with graffiti and sweat despite the cold. "Herr Doctor," Reinhardt called, his voice echoing in the great hall. "What is the current status?" The Reichsführer demands daily reports. Wirtz wiped his fogged glasses with an already dirty tissue and consulted a clipboard full of notes. "We are on schedule. Stack construction is 87% complete. We will begin low-power testing in 6 days. On January 20, if all goes as Professor Heisenberg predicted, we will reach criticality in approximately 3 weeks after initial testing. Reinhardt nodded curtly. What about the overheating issues that were reported last week? Wirtz's face contorted into an expression of suppressed frustration. Solved. Apparently, Professor Heisenberg recalculated the cooling flows and determined that our water channels were inadequate. We expanded them to his revised specifications. But, he hesitated, his voice lowering, I must admit that I do not fully understand the mathematics behind the revisions. When I asked the professor for further explanation, he told me that they were quantum mechanical considerations beyond my level of expertise. Reinhardt looked at Wirtz with the expression of a predator sizing up potential prey. Are you telling me you don't understand the project you're building? Wirtz stepped back slightly, his hands gripping the clipboard like a shield. No, Sturmbannfair, I understand the basic principles perfectly. It's just that some of Professor Heisenberg's most advanced refinements are at the absolute cutting edge of theoretical physics. Ace a genius, a Nobel laureate, it would be arrogant to assume that I could question his calculations. What none of them knew, what Heisenberg had carefully ensured no one would discover until it was too late, was that these advanced refinements were in fact calculated sabotage. The expanded cooling channels that Heisenberg had specified would remove heat from the reactor much more efficiently than necessary, preventing the pile from reaching the ideal temperature for sustained chain reaction. It was like trying to light a fire while simultaneously pouring water into it. Technically possible, but virtually impossible without adjustments that Heisenberg had already planned never to reveal. On January 21st, 1943, exactly on schedule, the first low-power test of the German reactor began. Heisenberg was present, naturally, wearing an immaculate white lab coat over his dark suit, his glasses reflecting the light from the fluorescent lamps that illuminated the makeshift control room. The room was small, just 20 feet by 4, with bare concrete walls except for a control panel that appeared to have been hastily assembled from miscellaneous components. 23 people were crammed into the claustrophobic space. Physicists, engineers, technicians, and 3 SS officers, including Reich, who insisted on being present to ensure there was no sabotage. The irony was not lost on Heisenberg, who kept his face carefully neutral as he led the countdown. Acting, Heisenberg announced, his voice calm and professorial even as his heart beat wildly in his chest. We are ready to begin. Herr Wirtz, remove the control bars in 4-inch increments, as we have discussed. Wirtz, sweating profusely despite the cold temperature, slowly pulled the levers that controlled the cadmium bars. These bars, when inserted into the reactor core, absorbed neutrons and prevented chain reactions. Removing them gradually would allow the reaction to begin in a controlled way, or at least that's what the theory said. The Geiger counters scattered around the room began to click faster, the sound increasing from occasional ticks to a steady crackle. Numbers on analog dials began to climb. Radiation level, core temperature, neutron production. Heisenberg observed everything with an expression of intense concentration, his eyes moving quickly between multiple instruments, making occasional notes in a notebook. The reaction is beginning, Wirtz announced, his voice tight with excitement. Action and fear mixed. Neutron production at 500% above background level. Core temperature rising, as predicted, 14 degrees Celsius, 16, double quotes, for 47 minutes. Everything seemed to be working perfectly. The nuclear reaction grew, exactly as predicted by Heisenberg's calculations, the false calculations he had officially presented. The SS officers seemed impressed and pleased. Wirtz was practically beaming with scientific success. And then, at minute 48, everything started to go wrong exactly as Heisenberg had secretly planned. The core temperature, which had been rising steadily and predictably, suddenly stabilized. The Geiger counters, which had been accelerating, maintained a constant level instead of continuing to increase. The chain reaction, which should have been amplifying toward sustained criticality, simply stopped growing. Wirtz looked at the instruments with increasing confusion. I don't understand. Neutron production should be increasing exponentially right now, but it's constant. The temperature should be at 60 degrees, but it's stuck at 23. Heisenberg frowned, a carefully rehearsed performance of scientific bewilderment. Fascinating. The reaction has reached a plateau. This suggests there is a neutron absorption mechanism that has not been accounted for in our theoretical models. He leaned over his instruments, taking quick notes. Herwarts, increase the removal rate of the control bars. Let's see if we can push it beyond this limit. Over the next 3 hours, they tried every possible variation. More control bars removed, less cooling, more uranium added to the core. Nothing worked. The reactor refused to go beyond approximately 40% of the criticality required to produce military-grade plutonium. Eventually, with frustration visible on everyone's faces, except Heisenberg's, they shut down the experiment. Reinhardt, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke, his voice thick with suspicion and barely concealed threat. "Professor Heisenberg, what exactly just happened here? Was this a success or a failure?" Heisenberg removed his glasses and slowly wiped them with a tissue, a gesture he often used when he needed time to choose his words carefully. "This was a qualified success. We have demonstrated that a sustained nuclear reaction is possible. However, we have also discovered that our theoretical models need significant refinement. There are physical phenomena occurring at the quantum level that were not completely understood in our preliminary calculations." He replaced his glasses and looked Reinhardt straight in the eyes, his expression that of a patient teacher explaining difficult concepts to a mediocre student. "Nuclear science is literally being invented as we go. The Americans, if they are indeed working on their own project, as we suspect, face exactly the same challenges. In fact, I would be surprised if they are not encountering similar or worse problems." Reinhardt didn't seem convinced, but he also didn't have the knowledge to argue how long to work out these refinements. Heisenberg made a thoughtful expression, as if he were mentally calculating, when in fact he already knew exactly what answer he would give. Maybe 6 weeks for full analysis and recalculation, then another 4 to 6 weeks for physical modifications to the reactor, then further testing. What he didn't say, what he would never say, was that those recalculations would be carefully designed to introduce subtle new errors that would replace the old ones, keeping the reactor permanently below operational functionality while always appearing to be on the verge of a decisive breakthrough. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world at Los Alamos, American progress was advancing, though not without its own enormous difficulties. On February 27, 1943, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, 39 years old, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, was in his modest office discussing recent test results with Dr. Enrico Fermi, 42 years old, an Italian physicist who had fled fascist Europe and was now leading the reactor development effort in Chicago. Fermi had arrived at Los Alamos that morning after a 3-day train ride, and he looked exhausted but excited. Oppenheimer, tall and thin to the point of illness, smoked one cigarette after another as he listened to Fermi describe the successes in Chicago. "Robert," Fermi said in his heavily accented English, gesturing with his hands excitedly, "the Chicago Pia 1 reactor has reached criticity sustained last December 2, as you know. Since then, we have operated at various power levels and collected extraordinary data on chain reaction behavior." He spread out a series of graphs and tables on Oppenheimer's desk. "See here, the neutron production behaves exactly as we predicted. Temperature stabilizes at design levels. Cooling is adequate. In short, all of our theoretical calculations have been confirmed experimentally." Oppenheimer studied the data through swirls of cigarette smoke, his sharp eyes immediately capturing the crucial points. "Plutonium production." Fermi smiled, a rare expression on a normally serious man. "Ah yes, plutonium. We began recovering small amounts of core last week. It's preliminary. It needs further refinement. But Robert," he paused for emphasis, "it works. The transmutation of uranium into plutonium occurs exactly as theory predicts. If we scale up to full production reactors, we could have enough military-grade plutonium for a bomb in perhaps 18 months. Oppenheimer stubbed out his cigarette in an ashtray, already overflowing with crushed ends, and immediately lit another. 18 months. Intelligence reports say the Germans could have something in 12 to 15 months. We're racing against Heisenberg. And losing Fermi slowly shook his head. "Maybe, or maybe not. Robert, I knew Werner Heisenberg before the war. We studied together, debated physics at conferences all over Europe. He is brilliant, without a doubt one of the greatest theoretical physicists of our generation. But," and here Fermi's voice grew lower, more thoughtful. I've always noticed something about Werner. He has a deep moral conscience about science. He sees physics not just as abstract mathematics, but as knowledge that carries responsibility. Oppenheimer looked at Fermi with renewed interest. Are you suggesting that Heisenberg might be deliberately sabotaging the German project? Fermi shrugged, a very Italian gesture. I'm saying that if I were in Werner's position, working for a regime that I despised but could not openly challenge, with knowledge that could give that regime absolute power, I would consider very carefully how my work might be interpreted. It was a radical, almost impossible idea to believe, but Oppenheimer did not dismiss it outright. Instead, he tucked it away in the back of his mind, a possibility to consider as the nuclear race continued. In April 1943, Heisenberg presented his recalculations in a tense meeting with Speer and an even larger group of Nazi officials at the Black Forest compound. The conference room was a rectangular, bare concrete chamber with a long, polished oak table that looked grotesquely elegant amid the industrial brutality of the underground environment. 28 people were present, including two Heisenberg's silent terror, Heinrich Himmler himself, 53 years old, Reichsführer of the SS. The man who had personally ordered the murder of millions. Himmler was shorter than Heisenberg expected, just 5 feet 10 inches, with wire-rimmed glasses similar to Heisenberg's and a general appearance of an accountant or high school teacher rather than one of the most dangerous men in the world. But his eyes, cold and calculating behind the lenses, held nothing professorial or harmless. Heisenberg presented for 45 minutes, his voice remaining calm and professorial even as he knew that one wrong word, one suspicious hesitation, could mean death not just for him but for Elizabeth and her 7 children. He drew complex diagrams. He wrote equations that looked impressive, but contained subtle errors that only a few physicists in the world could detect. He explained in dense technical jargon why the reactor needed specific modifications that would, in reality, ensure that it would never function properly. When he finished, there was silence for long seconds. Then Himmler spoke, his voice surprisingly high for a man of his reputation. Professor Heisenberg, let me see if I understand correctly. You're telling me we need another 6 months? 6 months beyond the schedule you previously presented to us. That puts us at October at the earliest, before we have enough plutonium for a bomb. Heisenberg felt cold sweat running down his back under his lab coat and suit, but he kept his expression neutral and academic. Reichsführer, with all due respect, nuclear science cannot be rushed beyond certain fundamental physical limits. The phenomena we are trying to control involve forces at the level of atomic nuclei, processes that nature normally takes millions of years to execute. May we have to do so in any time frame is in itself remarkable. Himmler stood up abruptly, making everyone in the room, including high-ranking SS officers, stiffen in automatic attention. He walked slowly around the table until he was directly in front of Heisenberg, his cold eyes studying the physicist as an entomologist would study an interesting but potentially dangerous insect. Professor Himmler said softly, a softness more menacing than any shout. You have a wife and 7 children, don't you? Is it living in Leipzig? If I remember correctly, Heisenberg's blood ran cold. It was an unveiled threat, clear as crystal. Yes. He managed his voice, surprisingly firm. And it is for them, for all German families, that I work day and night on this project. Science doesn't care about our human urgencies, Reichsführer. It operates on its own immutable laws. I can give the Reich an atomic bomb, but I cannot change the fundamental physics of the universe to speed up the process. Himmler continued looking at Heisenberg for another 10 seconds that seemed like an eternity. Then, abruptly, he nodded and returned to his seat. Very well. Professor, you have your 6 months, but understand clearly, there will be no more delays. If in October you come to me with more recalculations and more need for time, there will be severe consequences. Not just for you. The threat hung in the air like a toxic miasma as the meeting moved on to logistical matters. Heisenberg sat in his chair, his muscles shaking with suppressed adrenaline and fear, and realized that he had bought himself 6 more months, but at a price that might eventually be Those 6 months, from April to October 1943, were simultaneously the most productive and the most dangerous of the German nuclear program. Heisenberg routinely worked 18 to 20-hour days, balancing the impossible tightrope between appearing to be making real progress while ensuring that that progress never culminated in a functional weapon. He oversaw reactor modifications that seemed sophisticated but were designed to fail. He conducted experiments that produced impressive but misleading data. He trained engineers in techniques that were technically correct but practically inefficient. And all this time, he knew he was being watched. The SS had placed informants among the workers. His phone calls home were monitored. His letters to Elizabeth were read before delivery. Every word, every action, every facial expression was under constant scrutiny. In August 1943, an incident almost exposed his entire strategy. Dr. Wolfgang Gentner, 38 years old, an experimental physicist who had studied with Heisenberg in Göttingen years before, arrived at the Black Forest complex as a new senior member of the team. Gentner was brilliant, meticulous, and had deep enough technical knowledge to potentially detect the errors that Heisenberg had built into the design. It was August 23rd, exactly 1 year since Bohr's secret visit, and Heisenberg was in his office when Gentner knocked on the door. "Werner," Gentner said, closing the door behind him, his expression serious. "I need to talk to you about something disturbing I discovered." Heisenberg's heart stopped. This was the moment he had dreaded for months. "Of course, Wolfgang. Please, sit down." Gentner remained standing, holding a folder full of documents. "I've been reviewing your calculations for the reactor moderation configuration, specifically your estimates for neutron absorption by graphite." Heisenberg forced his expression to remain neutral, curious but not defensive. "Yes. Did you find an error?" Gentner placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing pages of densely written equations. "Not an error, exactly, but your absorption constants seem to be ... conservative. Very conservative. If I use the most recent values from the scientific literature, 2 Bulbus Fermi, published before he fled to America, the absorption would be significantly lower, meaning that the reactor could operate with perhaps 30% less graphite. This would speed up construction and reduce costs." Heisenberg took the papers and studied them, his mind working quickly. Gentner was right. Of course, the values Heisenberg had used were intentionally conservative, designed to make the reactor less efficient, but he could not admit that. Not directly. So he did something that had become his specialty. He wrapped the truth in layers of technical complexity that were individually true, but collectively deceptive. "Wolfgang," he said slowly, placing the papers back on the table, "you is absolutely correct about Fermi values, but you are forgetting to consider second-order interactions between thermal neutrons and the crystalline structure of graphite at elevated temperatures. These interactions produce an effect of increased absorption that is not captured in Fermi's experiments because he was working at lower temperatures." He picked up a pencil and began quickly writing equations. "See here, when you factor in the lattice vibrations and spin orbital coupling in the high-energy regime that our reactor will operate in, you get a correction that justifies my conservative constants." What Heisenberg had written was mathematically correct, as pure physics, but it was inappropriately applied to the specific context. The effects that he described existed, technically, but they were so small that they were essentially negligible for practical reactor design purposes. However, unless Gentner spent days recalculating everything from scratch using first principles, which would be seen as insubordinate questioning of the project director, he would have no way of proving Heisenberg wrong, but something, it didn't quite fit. Finally, Gentner slowly shook his head. "I would need more time to check this out completely, Werner. It's subtle physics." Heisenberg smiled, an expression he hoped looked encouraging rather than relieved. "Please do. I always encourage independent verification. Science progresses through challenge and confirmation. If you find a genuine error in my calculations, I will be the first to thank you for the correction." But he knew, and he was betting that Gentner also suspected on some level, that any independent verification would be complicated by the fact that Heisenberg controlled what data and references were available at the facility. And so the dangerous moment passed. But Heisenberg knew that he could not keep improvising answers indefinitely. October 1943 arrived, and with it the deadline that Himmler had set. On October 15th, Heisenberg was summoned to Berlin to present results to Hitler himself. The meeting took place in the Vorbunker, the underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery where Hitler increasingly conducted state business as the war turned against Germany. Heisenberg was escorted through a series of security gates, identity checks, and narrow concrete corridors to a conference room where Hitler, Speer, Himmler, and several other high-ranking officials, whose names Heisenberg recognized but with whom he had never interacted, waited. Hitler, then 54, looked 10 years older, his face gray and eyes bloodshot from chronic insomnia and stress. His hands were visibly shaking, a symptom of Parkinson's disease that was progressing but not yet publicly known. He was sitting at the head of the table, smoking one cigarette after another despite his well-known views on the dangers of tobacco, a testament to his deteriorating mental state. The performance Heisenberg gave that day was the performance of his life. For an hour and 45 minutes, he explained in exhaustive technical detail why the project was progressing well, but not yet. Ready, he showed graphs of neutron production that looked impressive. It demonstrated critical mass calculations that suggested they were very close to a breakthrough. He explained in dense physical jargon why just a few more months would be needed. Hitler interrupted only 3 times, his questions surprisingly insightful for someone without formal scientific training. "Professor," Hitler said during the 3rd interruption, his voice hoarse from years of speeches and tobacco, "the Americans, do you believe they have their own program?" Heisenberg chose his words with extreme care. "Mein Führer, intelligence suggests so, but they face the same fundamental technical challenges as we do. Physics is the same for everyone." More importantly, they expelled many of their best physicists for being Jews or communist sympathizers. This left them with a diminished talent pool. Hitler nodded, appearing satisfied with this answer, which confirmed his racial prejudices. "And how long, realistically, before we have a working bomb?" This was the question Heisenberg had been dreading and preparing to answer for weeks. He took a deep breath. "Mein Führer, being completely honest and realistic, I would estimate at least 8 additional months for a test device, maybe a year for one bomb deliverable per aircraft. This assumes that we do not encounter unforeseen technical problems, which, in a project this radical newness, is always possible." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Heisenberg could see Himmler looking at him with those cold reptilian eyes, calculating, suspicious. Speer looked frustrated but resigned. And Hitler simply looked tired. The fate had been, as if this were just another blow in an escalating series of bad news. 1 year, Hitler finally said, more to himself than to the others. "In 1 year, where will we be? The Soviets have already reversed our offensive on Kursk. The Allies control it. American bombers destroy our cities night after night." He looked directly at Heisenberg. "An atomic bomb was supposed to be our salvation, Professor. The weapon that would change everything." Heisenberg felt a complex mix of emotions: guilt for deceiving his own country, even if it was a country controlled by monsters, fear of what might happen if he were discovered, and a deep, deep exhaustion. "Mein Führer," he said softly, "science cannot be rushed beyond certain limits. We are doing the impossible. I only ask for patience to do the impossible correctly." Hitler waved his hand, a gesture of dismissal. "You have your 8 months, Professor, no more." Speer, "Make sure he has all the resources he needs." Himmler, "Ensure there is no sabotage or interference. This is our last chance for a decisive turn in the war. We cannot fail." As Heisenberg was escorted out of the bunker, back through the claustrophobic concrete corridors, he realized that he had bought himself more time, but was running out of tricks. Eventually, someone would find out. Eventually, his carefully planned mistakes would be exposed. The question was, how long could he keep up the charade before everything fell apart? During the following months, from October 1943 until April 1945, Heisenberg continued his delicate dance, but the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The war was clearly lost for Germany. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June 1944. The Soviets advanced inexorably from the east. German cities were reduced to rubble by bombings day and night, and the Nazi regime, in its growing desperation, became increasingly paranoid and violent at any suspicion of disloyalty. In January 1945, what Heisenberg feared most occurred. Wolfgang Henner, the physicist who had questioned his calculations months earlier, finally completed his independent verification and discovered the inconsistencies. It was January 15th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when Jetner walked into Heisenberg's office without knocking, his expression a mix of confusion, anger, and something that seemed dangerously close to understanding. "Werner," Jetner said, closing the door and standing against it, as if blocking an escape. "I've reviewed all your calculations. All of them. It took me months, working at night after everyone left, checking every equation, every constant, every assumption." Heisenberg felt a chill spread across his stomach, but kept his expression neutral, and Jetner placed a voluminous folder on the table, so full of papers it barely closed. "And I found errors. Not casual errors or miscalculations, systematic errors, always in the same direction, always resulting in overly conservative estimates, always delaying the project." His voice became quieter, almost a whisper. "Werner, these errors are too consistent to be accidental. Someone with your training, your experience, your Nobel Prize doesn't make these types of mistakes by chance, unless ... double quotes he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence. Heisenberg looked at Jetner for a long moment, making a decision that could mean life or death, not just for him, but for his entire family. Then, slowly, he removed his glasses, placed them on the table, and rubbed his tired eyes with both hands. When he spoke, his voice was filled with an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. "Wolfgang, do you have a family?" Jetner seemed surprised by the question. "Yes, wife and 2 daughters." "Why do you ask?" Heisenberg stood up and walked to the small window of his office, although it only looked out onto another inner corridor of the underground complex. "I have 7 children, Wolfgang. 7 children who didn't ask to be born into a world where their father has to choose between their conscience and their lives." He turned to face Jetner. "If I told you that certain mistakes could sometimes be less dangerous than certain certainties, would you understand?" Jetner turned pale as the implication became clear. "Mein Gott, Werner, you're sabotaging the project." Deliberately. Heisenberg neither confirmed nor denied verbally, but his expression said "Tiud." Jetner slumped into a chair, the briefcase falling from his hands onto the floor, scattering papers. "Do you realize what they'll do if they find out? Not just you, but Elizabeth, your children, anyone they think might have helped or known." Heisenberg nodded slowly. "I think about this every night, Wolfgang, every single night. But then I think about what will happen if Hitler gets an atomic bomb. London vaporized, Moscow destroyed, then New York, Washington, Moscow, millions dead in seconds. And all because a German physicist didn't have the courage to do what was necessary." Jetner sat in silence for long minutes, processing everything. Finally, he spoke. "What do you need from me?" Heisenberg felt relief flood through him. "Your review? I need you to find errors that warrant further delay. Errors that seem plausible, that I can pretend I made through overwork or inadequate data. Can you do that?" Jetner picked up the scattered papers and began to reorganize them. "I'm a scientist, Werner. A good scientist, and good scientists know that sometimes experiments fail for reasons that aren't immediately obvious." It was an unspoken pact, a conspiracy of 2 men against a regime that was crumbling but still deadly. But time was running out faster than either of them realized. In February 1945, as the Soviets surrounded Berlin and the Americans crossed the Rhine, Himmler called an emergency meeting at the Black Forest complex. It was the 28th of February, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and the meeting took place not in a civilized conference room but directly in the Hallinell, next to the reactor that had consumed 2 years of work and millions of Reichsmarks without producing usable results. Himmler arrived accompanied by 20 heavily armed SS guards, a not-so-subtle statement that this was not a scientific discussion but a trial. Eisenberg, Kinder, Wirtz, and 8 other scientists and engineers were lined up in front of the reactor like prisoners before a firing squad. Himmler wasted no time with preliminaries. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing in the great concrete hall, "you have been charged with the most important task of the war, giving the Reich the weapon that would guarantee our final victory. Millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of men, 2 years of work. And what have we to show for it?" He gestured to the reactor. "A pile of graphite and uranium that doesn't work, that never worked properly, despite countless refinements and recalculations." His gaze fixed on Heisenberg. "Professor Heisenberg, Nobel laureate." Germany's most brilliant physicists, or so we've been told. I have a very simple question for you, and I strongly recommend that you answer it with absolute honesty. Are you deliberately sabotaging this project? The silence that followed was so absolute that Heisenberg could hear his own heart beating, could hear the breathing of the men around him, could hear the distant hum of electrical generators above. Everything depended on how he answered this question. If he admitted it, he was dead, his family was dead, and probably every other scientist in the room was too. If he denied it, but wasn't convincing, the Samafade, the only chance was a performance so convincing, so apparently sincere, that even Himmler would have to doubt his suspicions. Heisenberg stepped forward, slowly removing his glasses and holding them in his hands. He looked Himmler straight in the eye, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, but charged with carefully calibrated emotion, exhaustion, and something that sounded dangerously close to despair. "Reichsführer," he began, "I swear on the lives of my 7 children, on the memory of my deceased mother, on everything that is sacred to me, that I am not sabotaging this project. I am trying, with every ounce of my ability, with knowledge that took me decades to acquire, to do what no human being has ever done before, to control the power of the atom itself." He gestured to the reactor. "Yes, we faced delays. Yes, we encountered unexpected problems. But this is not sabotage, Reichsführer. This is science at the absolute cutting edge of human knowledge. Einstein did not develop relativity in a year. It took Marie Curie decades to understand radioactivity. We are trying to do in 2 years what should have taken 10, 15 years of methodical research." He replaced his glasses, his hands visibly shaking, a tremor that was only partially staged. "If I were a saboteur, Reichsführer, I wouldn't be so stupid as to make obvious mistakes that anyone could detect. I would make the reactor explode. I would make catastrophic mistakes that would destroy the entire facility. Instead, we have a reactor. It works, just not as efficiently as we need. This is not sabotage. This is physics being stubborn, as physics often is. It was a brilliant defense, because it was true in the details, while lying on the whole. Every individual fact Heisenberg presented was verifiable. It was only the interpretation of those facts that was misleading. Himmler studied Heisenberg for long seconds, his reptilian eyes showing no emotion. Finally, he turned to SS-Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, his closest aide. "What do our own experts say? The people we brought in to review independently." Fegelein consulted a folder. "Sir, experts confirm that physics is extraordinarily complex. They cannot definitively prove sabotage. But," he hesitated, "they also cannot explain why problems keep appearing in areas that should be resolved." Himmler turned his attention to Heisenberg. "Very well, Professor. You have one more chance. One final chance. You have 8 hours. Heisenberg blinked, certain he had heard wrong. 8 hours. Himmler smiled, an expression without warmth or humanity. "Yes, 8 hours. You and your team will spend the next 8 hours doing everything necessary to make this reactor reach sufficient sustained criticality for production of military-grade plutonium. No excuses. No more recalculations. No more delays. At 2 in the morning, exactly 8 hours from now, this reactor will operate, or you will all face appropriate consequences for treason against the Reich." He gestured to the guards. "These men will remain here, watching your every move. My own technical experts will also be present to ensure that no sabotage occurs in these final 8 hours. If the reactor works, you will be heroes of the Reich. If not, ... double quotes." He left the unspoken threat hanging in the air. "Now, get to work." The next 8 hours were the most intense and terrifying of Heisenberg's life. He and his team worked under the watchful eyes of 20 SS guards and 3 of Himmler's technical experts, who were actually engineers, with enough knowledge of physics to detect obvious sabotage, but not enough to understand the deeper It was 6:15 in the afternoon when they started. Heisenberg gathered Jetner, Wirtz, and the other leading scientists in a quick council of war, their voices low but urgent. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are in an impossible position. If we get the reactor working properly, we give Hitler an atomic bomb. If we don't, we die tonight, along with our families. We need to find a middle ground." Wirtz, whose face was pale with fear, whispered frantically, What middle ground? It either works or it doesn't work. There is no middle ground in nuclear physics. But Gentner, who now understood Heisenberg's strategy, saw the solution. Yes, there is, he said, slowly. We can make the reactor reach criticality long enough to satisfy observers, but configure it so that it is unstable, that it self-destructs before it can actually produce usable plutonium. Heisenberg nodded, relief flooding through him. Exactly, Wolfgang. You understand perfectly. Let's give them their success, but a success that will prove futile in the longer term. They worked frantically. They removed more control bars, deliberately exceeding normal safety margins. They adjusted cooling flows to dangerously low levels. They reconfigured neutron moderators into patterns that would maximize short-term output but lead to inevitable instability. And as they worked, Heisenberg maintained a running dialogue with the SS observers, explaining each step in technical jargon that sounded impressive, but, "See here," he said, pointing to a set of valves. "We are increasing the rate of thermal neutron moderation by a factor of 15, which will increase the effective fission cross-section by approximately 12%. The SS observers were taking notes diligently, understanding perhaps one word in 5, but unable to challenge the Nobel laureate who was using language they had been taught to respect as superior German science. Night, 3 hours and 15 minutes into the 8-hour deadline, the reactor began to show promising signs. The core temperature rose exponentially. At 11:30, an hour and a half before Himmler's deadline, the reactor reached sustained criticality for the first time in 2 years of trying. It was producing enough neutrons to transmutate uranium into plutonium. By all observable parameters, the project had finally succeeded. The SS observers were visibly excited, beaming urgent messages to him. The scientists, except Heisenberg and Gentner, seemed genuinely relieved and even proud. Only Heisenberg and Gentner knew the truth that the current configuration was fundamentally unstable, that within hours, or at most days, the reactor would begin to exhibit fluctuations that would grow in amplitude until eventually requiring shutdown. But for now, in this moment, it felt like a triumph. At 1:53 in the morning, 7 minutes before the deadline, Himmler arrived in person with a retinue of high-ranking officers. He entered Halle null like an emperor entering his domain, his usually cold expression now showing something that could have been satisfaction. Heisenberg, exhausted beyond anything he had experienced before, covered in sweat and shaking with fatigue and adrenaline, presented the results. Reichsführer, the reactor reached sustained criticality to hours and 23 minutes ago, and has maintained stable levels since then. Neutron production is within predicted parameters. The transmutation of uranium into plutonium is proceeding as theory predicts, with continued operation for approximately 6 to 8 weeks. We will have enough military-grade plutonium for a test device. Himmler looked at the instruments, the displays, the graphs that scientists kept up to date. He didn't understand physics, but he understood success when he saw it. "Congratulations, Professor Heisenberg," he said formally. "You and your team have proven your worth to the Reich. When this bomb falls on London, the world will remember that it was German science, Hermann genius, that changed the course of the war." Heisenberg forced a smile, accepted the congratulations, and watched Himmler depart with his entourage. And then, when everyone had finally left, except his closest team, he slumped into a chair, his body finally giving in to complete exhaustion. Gentner sat next to him. "How long, Werner? How long before it starts to disintegrate?" Heisenberg, his eyes closed, responded in a low voice. 48 to 72 hours before the fluctuations become obvious. Maybe a week before it becomes completely unstable. And then we'll have to shut down for maintenance and adjustments, which gives us, hopefully, a few more weeks of delays, while we pretend to diagnose and fix problems. Wirtz, who had heard it, shook his head in admiration, mixed with horror. "You really are crazy, Werner. Brilliant, but completely crazy." Heisenberg opened his eyes and looked at the reactor, which was, at this moment, functioning exactly as designed, while carrying within it the seeds of its own inevitable failure. "Maybe," he said softly, "but sometimes madness is the only sane response to a world gone mad." But Heisenberg had underestimated a critical factor, the march of time itself and the impending collapse of the Reich. Just 2 days later, On February 26, while the reactor was still operating within its temporary stability window, advance units of the American Army, moving faster than anyone had predicted, arrived just 25 miles from the Black Forest complex. Reconnaissance pilots had identified the facility as a high-priority target weeks earlier, and now a specialized task force, codenamed Operation Alsos, was speeding toward the site, with orders to capture the facility intact and, more importantly, capture the German scientists before the Soviets could reach them. Colonel Boris Pash, 35, a former football player turned military intelligence officer, commanded the Alsos force. It was February 26th, 5 in the morning, when his units, made up of 400 infantry soldiers, supported by 12 Sherman tanks, began their assault on the installation. SS resistance was fierce but brief. The German guards, many teenagers or older men from the Volks, fought with the desperation of those who know the war is lost but cannot yet accept defeat. The fight lasted 3 hours and 12 minutes. When it was over, 73 Germans were dead, 126 captured, and the Americans controlled the entrance to the underground complex. Pache, a large man at 6 feet tall with 200 pounds of muscle, personally led the descent through the complex's levels, his Thompson submachine gun in hand, soldiers fanning out to secure each corridor and chamber. When they finally reached Hallinol, they found Heisenberg and his team still there, working on the controls of the still-functioning reactor. VA, it still produced neutrons. It still created plutonium atom by atom. For a moment frozen in time, the two groups simply looked at each other. Combat-stained American soldiers and Germans in graffiti-stained white lab coats, separated by 20 meters of concrete floor and a gulf of loyalties, ideologies, and destinies. Then Heisenberg did something completely unexpected. He walked slowly toward the Americans, his hands visibly empty and raised. And when he was approximately 5 meters away, he stopped and said in fluent, German-accented but perfectly understandable English, "Colonel, I presume? My name is Werner Heisenberg. I am the scientific director of this project, and I need you to shut down this reactor immediately before it becomes critically unstable and kills us all." Pash lowered his gun a fraction, his expression confused. "You want me to shut down your own reactor? Why the hell would you do that?" Heisenberg allowed himself a small, exhausted smile, the first genuine smile in 2 years. "Because, Colonel, this reactor is set to fail catastrophically within approximately 80 to 24 hours, and because I have spent the last 2 years and 3 months ensuring that Adolf Hitler would never, ever have a working atomic bomb. Now, please let me shut it down before we kill us all in a radioactive vapor explosion." Understanding slowly filled Pash's face. Were you sabotaging your own project? This whole time? Heisenberg nodded, a deep fatigue visible in every line of his body. "Yes, this whole time. And now, if you don't mind, I'd like to sit down, have a cup of coffee, and explain exactly how I made one of the most dangerous men in history think he was 8 hours away from having the weapon that would have changed the course of the war, when in fact he was never even remotely close. It was then, at that moment, that the true nature of what Heisenberg had done began to become clear. Not just technical sabotage, but a masterful psychological performance that had kept Nazi leaders believing in imminent victory, while ensuring that victory never came. In the following weeks, as Heisenberg and his team were extensively debriefed by American physicists, including Samuel Gauss, the 43-year-old Dutch-American physicist who led the Alsos scientific intelligence mission, the full extent of Heisenberg's engineering revealed itself. The errors were not just technical but strategic, psychological, maintained 4 years through layers of complexity that only a genius could have constructed and sustained. Goudsmith, sitting with Heisenberg in an interrogation room converted from an SS office, leafed through hundreds of pages of captured calculations and reports. It was March 15th, 1945. 3 weeks after the capture of the facility. "Werner," Goudsmith said, shaking his head in mingled admiration and horror, "do you realize that if there had been just one other physicist of your caliber on the project, someone who could have caught its mistakes, this would have ended very differently?" Heisenberg, who had regained some of his strength, but still looked 20 years older than he had before the war, nodded slowly. "I thought about it 1,000 times, Sam. 1,000 times I was almost discovered." Gentner, almost caught me. Others had suspicions, but in the end, Nazi arrogance was my greatest ally. They could never believe that a German Nobel laureate, a proven pure Aryan for generations, would betray them. Their own ideology blinded them to the possibility. The war ended in May 1945. Just 2 months after the capture of the Black Forest complex, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. And the world discovered that it had been 8 hours away from a very different fate, not because the Nazis had actually been so close to success, but because Heisenberg had made them believe they were. In the following decades, Heisenberg's actions during the war became the subject of intense historical and scientific debate. Some called him a hero who saved millions. Others questioned his motivations, suggesting he failed through incompetence rather than deliberate sabotage. But they captured documents, the testimonies of Gentner and others who worked with him, and detailed technical analysis of his mistakes eventually established the truth. Werner Heisenberg had conducted the most sophisticated campaign of scientific sabotage in history, keeping Hitler hopeful while ensuring that that hope would never be realized. In May 1983, 38 years after the end of the war, a conference was held in Göttingen, Germany, bringing together nuclear and nuclear physicists, historiadors, to discuss the German atomic program. Heisenberg, then 81 years old, with completely white hair and a body bowed by age, was present. During a question-and-answer session, a young physics student asked the question everyone wanted to know. "Professor Heisenberg, weren't you afraid? Not just for yourself, but for your family. How did you live with that fear for years?" Heisenberg, his voice still clear despite his age, responded slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Young man, I was in absolute terror every day. Every morning I woke up thinking, this is the day I'm going to be discovered. Every night I went to bed thinking about Elizabeth and my children. But then I thought about what would happen if I didn't act. London vaporized. Moscow destroyed. Millions dead because I, who had the knowledge and position to stop it, chose my own safety over the fate of the world." He paused, his eyes looking away into the past. "The question you all want to ask, but are too polite to ask, is, would I have done the same if it weren't for the Nazis? If it had been a legitimate democracy asking for an atomic bomb?" And the answer is... I don't know. Thank God I never had to answer that question. I just had to answer, can I hand over the power of the gods to monsters? And the answer to that question, at least, was clear. The conference continued, but Heisenberg's response resonated through the years. He died on February 1st, 1986, at the age of 84, in Munich, Germany. In the weeks before his death, he was working on his final memoir, trying to articulate the impossible choices he faced during those terrible years. A passage from his notes, never completely edited for publication, perhaps better than anything else captures the essence of what he did. "People ask me if I feel I have cheated my country. My answer is that my country was stolen from me long before I could betray it. The Nazis took the Germany I loved and turned it into something monstrous. My loyalty was not to the monsters who wore the German flag, but to the principles that flag once represented. And when forced to choose between giving divine power to demons or risk everything to deny them, I chose the risk. If that makes me a traitor, then so be Italiano." History has indeed ruled, and the verdict of most historians and physicists who have studied the case extensively is that Heisenberg was, in the words of physicist Hans Bethe, the man who saved the world from its own science. He used his genius not to create, but to prevent creation. He pretended to be mad with dedication to the Reich, while he was perfectly sane in his sabotage. He kept Hitler hopeful and therefore less desperate, less likely to use chemical or biological weapons as a last resort, while ensuring that that particular hope never materialized. The 8 hours that Hitler thought stood between him and having the atomic bomb on April 20, 1945 were, in reality, a carefully constructed illusion. The reactor was never within 8 hours of producing usable plutonium. It was endless hours away because it was fundamentally poorly designed in ways that only Heisenberg and eventually Gentner fully understood. And when it finally seemed to work, it was set up to inevitably fail, buying a few more days or weeks of delay that Germany already didn't have. In the facility that was once the Black Forest underground complex, now a museum operated jointly by the German and American governments, there is a plaque at the entrance to what was Halle Nell. It reads, in German and English, in this place, from 1942 to 1945. Professor Werner Karl Heisenberg and his team worked on the German nuclear reactor project through scientific sabotage, carefully concealed as legitimate research. Professor Heisenberg ensured that Adolf Hitler never obtained nuclear weapons, while maintaining the appearance of progress that prevented the Nazi regime from executing scientists and their families. His action represents one of the most remarkable campaigns of intellectual resistance of World War II. Proved that, sometimes, the greatest courage lies not in doing what you can, but in preventing what you can do from falling into the wrong hands. His final 8 hours, working under threat of execution to make the reactor work, while simultaneously ensuring that it would never work properly, represent a final act of defiance against tyranny that sought to hijack science for purposes of untold evil. Visitors to the museum can walk down the same concrete corridors that Heisenberg walked. You can see the place where the reactor was, now dismantled but marked with lines on the floor showing its dimensions. They can read their original notebooks, where correct equations are written next to intentionally flawed versions. You can see photographs of Elizabeth and her 7 children that he kept on his desk, constant reminders of what was at stake. And in the last room of the exhibition, there is a final statement, quoting from Heisenberg's October 1943 presentation to Hitler, where he said he would need at least 8 additional months. Science cannot be rushed beyond certain fundamental physical limits. Alongside the quote, historians added context. Heisenberg was right, but not in the way Hitler understood. The limits were not just physical, but moral. And Heisenberg, working alone, except for a few trusted allies, proved that a scientist with a conscience could hold back even the power of the atom when that power threatened to fall into the hands of true evil. In the final 8 hours before Allied capture, the reactor functioned but was doomed. The Reich was doomed. And the world, unknowingly, had been saved by a man who chose to appear insane. Dedication while being perfectly sane in his refusal to deliver ultimate destruction to monsters.